So I spent the morning today reading Heiner Muhlmann's book, Maximal Stress Cooperation, which is a theory of the driving force of cultures. And I came across Muhlmann's work. As far as I know, he's a living professor in Germany who practices at a university there. And I came across him as the result of a footnote in one of Peter Sloterdijk's books. And I thought the theory sounded interesting, so I went and got the book. And the version of it that I have here is just a short little 70-page, almost just a long essay. But it's an essay that's very rich with ideas and very, very well worth the time it takes to read through it, which isn't very long. And there's another book that has been translated into English out of the German, which is called The Nature of Cultures. That one I haven't read yet. I wanted the distillation first, and this distills it beautifully, the basic idea of maximal stress cooperation. He starts off by saying that everyone remembers where they were at during the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And there's a reason for that, and it's because the stress of the attack imprints the emotions that are associated with major events, disasters, or war, or whatever the traumatic episode happens to be, will activate something that Muhlmann calls an episodic memory. And an episodic memory is simply a stressful memory in which you remember not only how you found out about something, but the entire circumstances surrounding the event, the whole structural episode of where you were at. So that's a type of episodic memory that results from a stressful event. And then he says that he will generalize to an idea that the formation of culture comes out of these types of events, maximum stressful events that unite a culture, increase cooperation on the inside of the culture, while conflict is directed on the outside against an aggressor. Whether the aggressor is real or imagined doesn't matter as far as the structure and dynamics of the MSC event, of the MSC theory goes. And so it's maximal. The stress of the event is maximal because it's mortal. So there's a mortal threat that's involved. So it's very serious, and it induces a culture to cooperate. And in our case, in the case of the Americans, the cooperation resulted in the attack that led to the current wars that we're still entangled in. In the case of the bombings in Spain that took place in Madrid in March of 2004, the end result of that was the Spanish government withdrew their troops from Iraq. So that had the opposite response. But it's the other response, the response of the attack against an aggressor, and this can be generalized throughout history to all different kinds of what I call boundary events. And a boundary event is what happens in a culture when there's a line that is drawn, like, for example, when Charles Martel meets the Islamic invaders that are coming up into France, and a boundary act is drawn there where Martel repulses them. Another boundary act, and these would also be, he doesn't mention these, but these would also be examples of maximal stress cooperation. Another boundary act, a more famous one, took place with the Maccabean revolt, when the Maccabees revolted against the Greeks who were trying to force on them the worship of Zeus, and to put Zeus in the temple in place of Yahweh, and they simply wouldn't do that, and they revolted and drew a cultural boundary line there. And in the case of the Greeks, the Battle of Marathon, the war against the Persians, that's another example of a boundary act and a maximal stress act that has the effect of uniting a culture and giving it power and energizing it against an aggressor. So those are boundary acts, and they're examples of the type of thing that Muhlmann has in mind here in the evolution of this theory. So the first thing he does is he wants to know what stress is and how it functions. And for that, he says that stress produces certain hormones in the brain, such as noradrenaline and adrenaline and cortisol, which put the individual in a stressful situation into a fight or flight mode. Over long periods of time, these kinds of chemicals, of course, can wear down the immune system, and increase cardiac functioning, lower the ability to sleep, lower the sex drive, and so it can ruin an individual with constant stress. An individual can die from stress as a result of this. And he says that he starts off by considering the paradigm of this type of monkey called the Tupaya monkey. And occasionally two males of the Tupaya monkey species will fight each other, and there will be a victor. And in the case of the victor's health will actually increase as a result of the lowering of these chemicals, these hormones, adrenaline and cortisol and noradrenaline. They will lower, and the monkey's health will improve, and will enter into a state of relaxation in which his health is better than before. And Muhlmann says this is the samurai effect, in which, because one is so good at war and combat, one eventually builds an aura of impenetrability about one, And that's the samurai effect, that warring leads to continued practice of war until it actually perversely reverses itself and produces continued relaxation. And the other monkey in this case, though, can either die if he is still within sight line of the victor, the male monkey who beat him. He might die as a result of these chemicals not lowering or diminishing in his bloodstream, in the endocrine system. But in most cases he won't die. He'll just suffer from a decreased immune functioning, decreased sex drive, and so forth. So this is the paradigm that he starts out with, and the structure of it to note is that stress is followed by relaxation on the part of a victor if the stressful event is interpreted non-negatively. It has to be interpreted positively, and if it is, there's a relaxation period that follows. And the relaxation period in human culture, of course, corresponds to the building of culture. Very often these stressful events will bring culture forth into being. We have in history Narmer, for example, who is the great pharaoh who comes up from the south, and after a great war with the north, binds the two lands together. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Upper and Lower Egypt, binds them together, and we get the creation of Egyptian art out of that. You get the famous Narmer plaque that shows Narmer on one side uniting the two countries with an animal with his two animals with their necks crossed as a symbol of the union of the two kingdoms. And so that's another example of a stressful event, a war that is followed by cultural efflorescence and production. But he says that one of the things that will happen is that rule formation is that a process, a phenomenon takes place that's known as rule formation or rule adjustment. And in this case, rules which led to the success of the stressful situation are then promoted to top positions on the rule scale, so that the more successful rules are repeated more and more often, and this leads to increased neuronal activity, and the neuronal reinforcement by means of repetition of the activity activates the body memory, and so body memory becomes active when all bodily movements are automatic, like when you're driving a car and you don't even have to think about driving. And so a high ranking in the rule adjustment then leads to what he calls memo activity, which is memory aptitude, and the successful application of rules then leads to them being stored in the body memory of a large number of individuals, which basic in a cultural population. And individuals, as a result, are enculturated, so that when the rule is applied, bodily movements are automatic. And enculturation simply means storage of cultural traits in the biological memory. Now, memory content is stored with especially lasting results, though, when perception is accompanied by strong emotional content. So, if the event is very stressful and emotionally straining, it will force the event, it will be much more likely to be remembered and culturally stored in the memory of a culture. And in that case, enculturation will then pass on the memory of the event through the process of the formation of culture. And he says that then he moves into, so he lays out that groundwork, and then he moves into this idea of the MSC, as he calls it for short, leads to the foundation of what he calls cultural founding events, which can either be wars, or in the case of religions, they can be the deaths of religious martyrs. And he says, take as an example of this Christianity with the death of Christ. So we have the crucifixion of Christ as a founding event, and certain individuals who are present at that event will have had the episodic memory of the event imprinted upon them, such as Mary Magdalene, Mother Mary, and John. These individuals were there, they were present at the event, they smelt the blood, they saw it, the olfactory bulb was activated, which also, the sense of smell, as Proust shows in Remembrance of Things Past, is crucial in burning memory into the psyche. It's one of the main, goes right into the limbic system. The limbic system is the mammalian brain. And they were there, they were present at the moment of the crucifixion, and so this produces what Muhlmann calls acute stimuli. And acute stimuli are then remembered from the original event, and they're passed along through the writing down of the Gospels. And in the creation of some type of media that remembers the event, the acute stimuli is downloaded and reduced to a latent stimuli. And this event then is transmitted culturally across the generations. So he has what he calls a vertical transmission, a transgenerational transmission of enculturated traits, which are transmitted vertically through the generations by means of a medium which records the original event, downloads the acute stimuli into a latent stimuli, but then the latent stimuli in the media that's transmitted can then be reactivated into an acute stimuli once again through ritual, through liturgy, through the emotional activation that comes with ritual that reactivates the emotions, recreates the original founding event, and keeps it alive. And this is how culture works. This is how it transmits vertically down the generations. And by horizontal cultural transmission, he simply means the passing along of cultural traits from one individual to another during the same generation. But it's the vertical aspect, the temporal passing of these enculturated traits over time, that's the key thing in the process of the formation of culture, and which creates and binds a community, creates a sense of cooperation amongst individuals, and creates and binds a community with this founding event. And so that's the basic idea of maximal stress theory as a culturally founding event. Then he moves on to talk about how, according to the theory of neural constructivism, the environment, and this is also this is known it's commonplace in phenomenology and German philosophy, that the environment there's nothing objective about the way it's perceived. It's a construct of a nervous system that is produced by a particular species that narrows the possibilities into a specific Umwelt, what the German biologist Jakob von Uexküll called an Umwelt, a world round that is selected from out of the totality of whatever the thing in itself of the world is, narrowed down, and that becomes a subjective experience for that species. The same thing happens with MSC constructs, what he calls MSC constructs, MSC models, in which the human nervous system creates a model, a construct of the world around it, and it does it by creating it out of culture, not just out of the nervous system, not just out of biology, but out of culture, and it creates this construct of the world, and the construct itself is invisible. The people who are in it aren't aware of it, like the proverbial fish and water of McLuhan, because it makes possible the ability to see a world, and it makes that which makes something perceptible is not itself perceptible, Muhlmann says. And so, but this is the basic cognitive map that brings forth a world as the result of this maximal stress cooperation idea. And then he says, he goes on to look at examples in history, like he says the American Civil War is an example of a founding event, a cultural founding event that led to the formation of rules, in this case that democratic states will not own slaves. That became a basic rule formation that resulted from the stress of the Civil War, and those individuals who participated directly in that Civil War would have been experienced to the acute stimuli of that war. And then it falls into latent stimuli with the writing of history books and such. But the acute stimuli can be activated again through parades and festivals, but it can also be reactivated through other wars. And so America is eventually led into the world wars and enters into the Second War. Muhlmann says the Second World War largely as a result of perceiving fascism as a threat to the rule formation, the rules that it created in the Civil War. So there's a basic threat there, and we have another boundary act. And so you get the phenomenon of World War II, and this is how these factors work out in history. He says that the Germans in World War II are an unusual situation. They're an odd example of what goes on here, an example in which, for the Germans, unlike he says all the other European states, and America included, had founding events, but the Germans didn't. They never had a founding event, so they had to manufacture one with Nazism. The Nazi outbreak was the attempt to manufacture their own stressful atrocity. And in that sense, we have a reversal of acute stimuli to latent stimuli, that is from actual event to media, in the sense that with Wagner's music corresponded to what would later normally be the latent stimuli, the mediatic formulation of the original founding event, by creating a sort of death cult, a German death cult out of this virtual world of Wagnerian music and opera and theater. And so we have the latent stimuli coming first, and then this death cult gradually leading to the creation of the acute stimuli of the inauthentic, the forced founding event of the Nazi atrocity. And so he says that the German culture has reversed, is the only example in which these two acute stimuli and latent stimuli are reversed, which is an interesting idea, actually. So then we move on from that to the idea of cities and how cities are laid out in terms of maximal stress cooperation.